Deep beneath the Egyptian desert, there are places history was forced to forget, chambers sealed in silence, records erased, truth buried on purpose. This is not legend. This is ancient Egypt at its darkest hour. For nearly 100 years, one man ruled as a living god. Pharaoh Pepi II. Official history calls his reign peaceful. But beneath the palace lies a horror that rewrites everything we think we know about power. This is not just the story of a pharaoh. It is the story of what happens when absolute power is given to a child, and an entire civilization chooses silence. If you want the real history, the story civilizations tried to erase, subscribe now. Because what you're about to hear was never meant to survive. The child who became a god was not born that day. A boundary was erased. Power touched a child before conscience ever formed. And Egypt would spend the next century paying for that mistake. The story does not begin with cruelty. It begins with silence. In the year 2278 BC, the royal palace of Memphis was unusually quiet, as if the stone walls themselves sensed that something unnatural was approaching. Pharaoh Pepi I was dead, officially taken by a scorpion's sting, though whispers already moved faster than truth through the corridors. Within the same week, the crown prince died under circumstances no priest could properly explain. In a kingdom obsessed with divine order, coincidence itself was a blasphemy. And so the throne passed to a child no one had prepared to rule, a boy of 6 years named Pharaoh Pepi, soon to be remembered simply as Pepi II. Egypt believed its pharaohs were gods in human form, not symbols, not metaphors, but living vessels of divine will. This belief was not taught gently. It was carved into flesh, memory, and ritual. At dawn, before thousands of nobles and priests, the coronation began. The child was stripped of his garments, his identity, his past. A sacred bull was brought forward, bred for this moment alone, and killed with ceremonial precision. Its blood filled a golden basin large enough to drown fear itself. Pepi was lifted and submerged into that blood, held beneath the surface until instinct overpowered dignity, and his small body struggled for air. This was meant to terrify him, to break him, to remind him of mortality before granting divinity. But when they pulled him out, something went wrong. The boy laughed. Not hysterically, not in shock, but with curiosity. He stared at his hands coated in blood as if they belonged to someone else, someone older, someone watching from above. A priest later wrote that this was the moment he felt true fear, not of the gods, but of what they had just created, because the ritual did not teach Pepi that he served divine order. It taught him that he was divine order. The next ceremony was meant to seal that belief. A condemned prisoner was brought before the child, and Pepi was handed a blade far too heavy for his small hands. He was told that a god does not hesitate, that a god commands life and death. The first strike failed. So did the second. Each attempt drew blood, each mistake watched by a silent court too afraid to intervene. And then something shifted. The child adjusted. He learned. Blow by blow, Pepi discovered that death was not instant, that it responded to technique, to patience, to persistence. When it was over, he stood not horrified, but thoughtful, as if he had learned a lesson no tutor could ever teach. That day did not traumatize Pepi II. It educated him. It taught him that suffering obeyed rules, that fear had stages, that power was not loud but absolute. Egypt's priests believed they were creating a god-king who would protect the cosmic balance. Instead, they created a ruler who never learned the difference between symbol and reality. To a 6-year-old, divinity was not responsibility. It was permission. What followed was not recorded in official inscriptions. Court artists carved scenes of peace, abundance, and eternal order. But private journals, foreign accounts, and fragmented papyri tell a different story. They describe a child who watched people closely, who asked questions no one wanted to answer, who learned early that no one could say no to him. Every command was obeyed, every curiosity indulged, every boundary dissolved before it could form. This is how monsters are not born, but assembled. Not through chaos, but through structure. Not through madness, but through belief. Pepi II did not wake up one day cruel. He woke up divine, in a world that never corrected him. And as Egypt celebrated the beginning of a long reign, no one noticed the quiet truth forming beneath the gold and incense. The God on the throne was still a child. And children, when given absolute power, do not understand limits. They test them. And Pepi II had just discovered that limits did not exist. The rituals no scroll was meant to remember. Some doors were sealed not to protect the dead, but to protect the living from knowing. What happened in the dark was never meant to survive the light, yet whispers always find a way through stone. As Pepi II grew older, the palace changed with him, not in ways visible to the public, but beneath the polished halls and sunlit courtyards, where officials praised the stability of his reign. Below the palace floors, new chambers were carved, not marked on any official plan, not blessed in public ceremony. Egypt was a civilization that wrote everything down, yet these rooms were deliberately left nameless. Silence became their protection. The priests understood something was shifting, but belief had already chained them. To question a living God was to question the universe itself. The early years of Pepi's rule were defined by observation. He watched people the way other children watched animals, studying patterns, reactions, and fear. Servants learned to keep their eyes lowered. Guards learned to breathe quietly. Even high officials felt uneasy under the long, unblinking stare of a boy who did not smile when others expected him to. Fear, he discovered, was most honest when it thought it was unseen. And so the first private rituals began, framed not as punishment, but as instruction. Lessons meant only for the divine ruler. The priests justified everything. They told themselves these were symbolic acts, ancient tests meant to refine the pharaoh's understanding of the mortal world. Egypt had always believed that a ruler must understand death to command life. What changed was the scale and the secrecy. Selected individuals were brought into underground chambers at night, recorded only in coded references, or not recorded at all. The rituals were never described plainly. They were referred to as preparations, offerings, or balancing acts. Language became a shield, softening what reality could not. Pepi's curiosity deepened as his authority grew. He began asking why some people endured fear longer than others, why some broke quickly, while others seemed to retreat inward, silent and distant. The priests answered with theology. Pepi answered with experimentation. Egypt's belief system did not stop him. It empowered him. If he was divine order made flesh, then every question he asked was sacred by definition. Every act became justified by belief alone. It was during this period that foreign traders and diplomats began recording strange observations. Greek and Levantine visitors wrote of disappearances, of servants reassigned and never seen again, of corridors sealed after midnight. These accounts were dismissed as exaggeration, the misunderstandings of outsiders who did not comprehend Egyptian customs. But archaeology would later confirm what official inscriptions denied: hidden chambers, unmarked graves, architectural expansions beneath the palace that served no administrative or religious function known to scholars. Pepi was no longer content to watch. He wanted control, not just over life and death, but over the space between them. Rituals became more structured, more deliberate. The priests no longer led, they followed. They adapted old traditions, twisted prayers meant for the afterlife into tools for the present. Egypt's gods had always demanded offerings. Now the offering was experience itself. Fear became a currency. Suffering, a demonstration of divine reach. What made these rituals especially dangerous was not their brutality, but their normalization. They became routine, absorbed into the machinery of the palace. Guards followed orders. Physicians ensured survival. Scribes adjusted records. Everyone played a role, and each role allowed its bearer to believe they were not responsible for the whole. This is how atrocity hides best, not behind madness, but behind procedure. Pepi learned quickly that silence was power. Those who survived said nothing, because silence was survival. Those who spoke vanished. Over time, even the idea of resistance faded. Egypt did not rebel, because Egypt did not fully know. The truth was fragmented, buried in whispers, half-records, and fear. History would later struggle to piece together what happened, because it was designed to be untraceable. By the time Pepi reached adolescence, the rituals were no longer experiments. They were expectations. The palace had adapted to him, and the civilization around it had adjusted its moral compass without ever admitting it had moved. What began as hidden ceremonies had become an invisible system, operating smoothly beneath the empire's surface. And the most dangerous part was this: Pepi was still learning, still refining, still curious. The rituals were no longer enough. He wanted understanding, precision, and something far more troubling than obedience. He wanted mastery. When pain became a science curiosity turned ritual into routine, routine turned belief into method, and method erased the last traces of mercy. By the time Pepi II entered his teenage years, something irreversible had happened inside the palace. The rituals were no longer framed as sacred tests or divine lessons. They had become systems, processes, repeated actions refined over time. Pepi had grown up surrounded by obedience, and obedience had taught him a dangerous lesson, that nothing resisted him, and therefore nothing limited him. Fear no longer fascinated him as spectacle alone. He wanted to understand it, measure it, control it. Egypt was a civilization obsessed with order. Crops followed seasons. Stars followed paths. Even death followed rules written in stone. Pepi absorbed this mindset and applied it where no one expected. He began asking structured questions. Why did some people endure longer? Why did others collapse quickly? Why did terror sometimes produce screams and sometimes silence? The priests responded with myth and metaphor, but Pepi was no longer satisfied with stories. He wanted data. What followed was the quiet transformation of cruelty into research. The palace scribes, once tasked with recording grain shipments and tax tallies, began maintaining sealed scrolls marked with symbols instead of words. Physicians trained to preserve life were reassigned to ensure endurance, not recovery, not mercy, endurance. Everything became categorized, controlled, and optimized. Suffering was no longer chaotic. It was calibrated. Pepi's mind, shaped by absolute authority, began treating human experience the way engineers treated stone and wood, as materials to be tested, adjusted, improved upon. He discovered that anticipation could be more powerful than action, that uncertainty weakened the spirit faster than force. He learned that isolation broke resistance, that repetition dulled hope, that survival itself could become a punishment when it removed the expectation of an end. These realizations did not come from madness. They came from observation. What made this phase of his reign especially dangerous was how seamlessly it blended into governance. No public executions increased. No visible chaos erupted. To the outside world, Egypt appeared stable, even prosperous. But beneath that surface, an entire philosophy was forming, one that treated pain as a spectrum rather than an event. Pepi began classifying reactions the way scholars classified plants. He gave names to emotional states that had never needed names before. Fear had stages. Surrender had patterns. Silence meant something different than obedience. Those closest to him noticed the change but did nothing. The priests told themselves this was divine wisdom beyond their understanding. Officials told themselves it was necessary to maintain order. Servants told themselves survival required compliance. Each person removed themselves one step from responsibility, and in doing so, allowed the system to grow. No one person created the machine. Everyone powered it. Foreign accounts from this period grow darker. Traders mention palace workers who avoided certain corridors. Diplomats describe audiences delayed without explanation. One fragment from a Nubian envoy records a warning given quietly over wine. Do not bring your sons. Such statements were dismissed as superstition or jealousy. Egypt was still the greatest power on earth. Who would believe that its god-king was turning curiosity into doctrine? Pepi himself believed he was pursuing knowledge. In his mind, understanding suffering meant mastering life. He did not see himself as cruel. He saw himself as thorough, a ruler who refused ignorance. In a society that worshipped wisdom, this self-image was never challenged. His tutors praised his intellect. His officials praised his focus. His priests praised his devotion to divine mysteries. No one ever praised his restraint. By the end of this period, the transformation was complete. The rituals were no longer hidden experiments. They were expected operations, supported by architecture, personnel, and belief. Egypt had crossed a line without ever marking the moment. Pain had become institutional. Fear had become infrastructure. And Pepi II, once a child placed on a throne, had become something far more dangerous than a tyrant. He had become convinced he was right. The empire that fed a monster evil no longer hid in shadows. It demanded infrastructure. Fear became policy. Silence became law. And an entire civilization began to starve for one man's appetite. By the time Pepi II reached middle age, the palace was no longer the center of power. It was the engine of something far darker. What had once been secret rituals and controlled experiments had now expanded beyond chambers and priests into the very bones of Egypt itself. This was the moment when cruelty stopped being personal and became industrial, when a man's obsession grew so vast that an empire bent to sustain it. Pepi no longer needed to search. Victims arrived, quietly, regularly, predictably. A new administrative office had been created under an innocent name, one that appeared ceremonial in official records. Its true purpose was never carved in stone, never praised in hymns, but everyone inside the palace knew what it meant. This office coordinated acquisition, transport, preparation, and disposal. Suffering now had logistics. Pain had schedules. Villages across Egypt began noticing patterns they could not explain. Boys of certain ages vanished, not all at once, not dramatically, one here, two there, always just enough to avoid panic, never enough to provoke revolt. Families were told their children had been selected for service, for blessing, for divine proximity. To refuse was unthinkable. To question was dangerous. Faith, once Egypt's greatest strength, became its most effective weapon against itself. As Pepi's desires grew more elaborate, Egypt's economy began to shift in ways no farmer could understand. Fields once dedicated to grain were repurposed. Flower cultivation expanded even as famine loomed. Beekeeping became a protected industry. Honey, once a luxury reserved for temples and medicine, was now produced in staggering quantities. While the Nile's floods weakened and hunger crept through the land, storehouses overflowed with sweetness meant for a single hidden purpose. This was not corruption. This was obedience. Entire regions adjusted production without ever being told why. Orders came from above, wrapped in religious language, stamped with divine authority. No one saw the full picture. Farmers grew what they were told. Merchants delivered what was demanded. Officials approved what arrived. Each person handled a fragment, and fragments do not feel guilty. Inside the palace, the system was perfected. Physicians were no longer healers, but calibrators, trained to prevent death without reducing awareness. Architects designed chambers that absorbed sound, drained fluids, and controlled airflow. Artisans forged restraints to precise measurements. Even animal breeders were recruited, selecting creatures not for beauty or strength, but for behavior. Aggression, endurance, reaction. Pepi watched all of it with the calm of a scholar. He no longer needed novelty. He needed precision. Sessions followed strict protocols. Timing mattered. Sequence mattered. Variation was introduced only after results were recorded. He spoke less now, not because he had grown merciful, but because he no longer needed to explain himself. The system understood him. It anticipated his needs. Foreign observers began writing darker accounts. Not stories, but warnings. A Levantan trader described Egypt as quiet in an unnatural way. A Nubian envoy noted that palace servants avoided eye contact like condemned men. A fragment from a later Greek source speaks of a king so old he could barely stand, yet whose will still terrified an empire. These accounts were dismissed as exaggeration, but archaeology would later uncover what words could not fully capture. Mass graves appeared on the outskirts of forgotten settlements. Bodies prepared improperly. Burials rushed. Patterns that made seasoned excavators stop digging and walk away. Egypt's official inscriptions, however, spoke only of peace, longevity, and divine favor. Pepi II's reign was celebrated as stable, prosperous, eternal, and in a narrow sense, it was. Stability had been achieved through terror, so normalized that it no longer needed force. By now, resistance was impossible. Too many people depended on the system. Too many benefited from not asking questions. Too many had convinced themselves that survival required silence. The empire had crossed a point where stopping meant collapse, and Pepi knew it. Absolute power had taught him the final lesson. When everyone is complicit, no one rebels. Yet beneath all this efficiency, a quiet problem was forming. Not rebellion. Not assassination. Something far more dangerous to a system built on endless supply. The children were running out. And Pepi II, nearing the end of his unnatural life, was about to discover that even gods are vulnerable when the machine they created begins to starve. The lie history chose to bury, the empire did not fall because of rebellion. It fell because the truth refused to stay underground. And what was uncovered shattered the myth of divine order forever. For centuries, Pepi II's reign was remembered as a golden age, 90 years on the throne. Stability without precedent. No civil wars. No foreign conquest. Official inscriptions praised harmony, prosperity, and divine favor. To later historians, it looked like perfection. Too perfect. And perfection, when examined closely, is often the most suspicious lie of all. The truth did not surface through Egyptian records. Those were carefully curated, polished, and incomplete. It emerged instead through absence. Missing generations. Population gaps that could not be explained by famine or disease alone. Entire villages recorded in tax lists, then erased from census rolls within a single decade. Archaeologists would later notice something unsettling. Cemeteries from Pepi's later reign contained far fewer young males than expected. Not scattered losses. Systematic disappearance. Foreign sources began connecting the dots long before modern scholars did. A fragmented account from Byblos describes Egyptian caravans traveling inland at night, guarded not like merchants, but like prisoners. A Nubian inscription speaks of the god who consumes youth. Greek writers centuries later would reference an unnamed Egyptian king whose palace was said to drink silence. These were dismissed as myth, until the ground itself began to disagree. The first mass grave was uncovered accidentally, far from any known battlefield. No weapons. No signs of plague. Bodies buried hastily, many showing evidence of restraint. The remains were not honored. They were hidden. As more sites were uncovered, a pattern emerged that no academic debate could soften. These were not victims of war. They were victims of a system. What shattered the remaining illusion was a collection of sealed papyri discovered near a collapsed administrative complex. These were not royal decrees or hymns. They were logistical records, lists, numbers, timetables. They documented transport routes, age ranges, physical criteria, and delivery schedules. No names, no crimes, no justification, just efficiency. This was the knife, the moment where speculation became confirmation. The documents revealed something far more disturbing than individual cruelty. They exposed participation. Thousands of people across Egypt had roles: scouts, guards, physicians, artisans, administrators. Everyone had a task, and no one wrote down why, because no one needed to. The reason was understood. Silence was survival. Pepi II did not hide his actions because he feared punishment. He hid them because he understood something fundamental about power. When terror becomes routine, it stops being shocking. When it stops being shocking, it stops being questioned. Egypt did not collapse during his reign because it had been hollowed out from within. Faith turned into obedience. Obedience turned into complicity. The final revelation came not from violence, but from collapse. Toward the end of Pepi's life, the system began failing. Not morally, logistically. The supply lines strained. The population thinned. The machine required constant input, and the empire could no longer provide it without destabilizing itself. For the first time, Pepi faced something he could not command: scarcity. When he died, there was no uprising, no celebration, no purge, just silence, and then decay. Without the central will sustaining it, the system unraveled rapidly. Officials abandoned posts. Priests rewrote theology. Scribes erased records. What could not be justified was buried. What could not be buried was denied. History was edited not to protect the victims, but to protect the idea of Egypt itself. This is the truth history tried to hide. Pepi II was not a singular monster operating in secret. He was the center of a structure built by belief, fear, and convenience. The empire did not just allow him. It adjusted itself to him. And when the cost became too great, it chose forgetfulness over accountability. The lie survived for thousands of years. But lies, no matter how deeply carved in stone, always crack. And in those cracks, the real story waits. What the gods never forgave, evil did not end with the tyrant. It ended with exhaustion. A god died quietly, but what he revealed about humanity still screams. This is not the end of a monster. It is the exposure of a pattern. Pepi II did not fall. He faded. After nearly a century on the throne, the living god of Egypt slipped into death without drama, without revolt, without justice. There was no blade, no poison, no uprising to cleanse the land. Only an old body finally failing after outlasting everyone who might have remembered who he once was. And in that quiet ending lies the most unsettling truth of all. Monsters do not always collapse under resistance. Sometimes they survive because no one dares to stop them. When Pepi died, Egypt did not confront what it had become. It dismantled nothing openly. There were no trials, no purges, no public reckoning. Instead, the empire chose amnesia. Priests rewrote theology to distance divinity from cruelty. Scribes revised chronicles, emphasizing longevity and stability while erasing everything that required explanation. Temples were purified, chambers sealed, names removed. The civilization did not heal. It buried. But history is patient, and the absence Pepi left behind spoke louder than any inscription. The generation gaps remained. The unbalanced cemeteries remained. The architectural scars beneath the palace remained. Egypt entered a slow collapse, not because it lacked resources or enemies, but because something essential had been consumed. Trust, population, moral authority. The state had been restructured around terror, and when terror lost its central figure, nothing coherent remained to replace it. This is where the story stops being about Pepi II and becomes about us. Because he was not unique in his psychology. What made him dangerous was not cruelty alone, but permission. Unlimited power, acquired before conscience formed, sustained by belief, and protected by silence. Egypt did not create a monster by accident. It followed its rules too well. It believed its myths too deeply. It obeyed without interruption. The most devastating lesson is this: Pepi did not need to hide forever. He only needed to normalize. Once atrocity becomes routine, it no longer feels like evil. It feels like procedure. Everyone involved told themselves they were just one part of a larger system. Farmers grew what they were told. Physicians did their jobs. Officials followed orders. Each individual action seemed small. Together, they built something unstoppable. History likes villains because villains are simple. They allow us to believe that evil is rare, obvious, and separate from ordinary life. Pepi II destroys that comfort. He shows us a darker truth, that evil scales best when it is organized, justified, and left unquestioned. When belief replaces morality, when obedience replaces responsibility, when silence becomes survival. This is why his story was buried, not because it was unbelievable, but because it was too familiar, because it reveals that civilizations do not fall only through invasion or disaster. They fall when they surrender their judgment to authority and call it order, when they trade empathy for stability, when they accept that some suffering is necessary as long as it remains unseen. Pepi II believed he was a god because everyone around him treated him like one. And gods, when unchecked, do not become wiser. They become entitled. The tragedy is not that one man lived too long. The tragedy is that millions adjusted themselves to him. In the end, Egypt survived his reign, but it never recovered its soul. And that is the final, devastating reflection history leaves us with. Monsters are not born in darkness alone. They are sustained in daylight by systems that reward silence and punish resistance. The question Pepi II leaves behind is not how such a ruler existed. It is how long we allow them to.